Welcome to the PricePlow Podcast. It is March 1st of 2023, and we are honored to have Elan Sudberg of Alkemist Labs here. We met over LinkedIn, where on your profile picture, you have an image that says control group, and your pronouns are, you go as told/you/so. So I think we know where this is going to go in a bit, but we're really, really interested about the testing that you're doing at Alkemist Labs. So welcome to the show, and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so first, thank you. Thanks for identifying me for who I am. Right there, let's just jump to it. My name is Elan Sudberg, CEO of Alkemist Labs. We are a 27, I don't even know anymore, 26, 27-year-old independent testing lab, father and son owned. It's basically everything I've done since high school and all I know. We are basically plant and fungus cops. We make sure people have the right raw ingredients, or those raw ingredients got into the finished products, or the finished product sellers are selling the right materials. We test all the plants, all the fungi, the psychedelic ones, the legal ones, chamomile, cannabis, mushrooms, legally. We have a federal ability to do that. And then we also have a nice new program to help brands show their high quality to consumers at the consumer level with just called Alkemist Assured. So that's the newest push that we have here.
Wow. I'm super curious about so much, but I think one of the biggest things I want to set the tone of the conversation is that one of the things that I try to impress upon people all the time is that even though you buy a fancy product in a store, which is seemingly trustworthy, there is very little that you can openly trust on its own. And I think when I heard about Alkemist Labs, I had heard about how outspoken you were about these kinds of things. And I relate to that, and I appreciate that, because there's a lot of very buttoned up labs in the industry, very corporate. And, I respect sometimes, you have to be a PR firm and everything, but I think that we have a very pressing issue in the industry. And I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited to talk about literally everything you just brought up. The psychedelics to the botanicals to the assurance for brands. I think we got a lot to get over in the next hour.
Right. So, and obviously a lot of our followers are going to be in sports nutrition, but it sounds like, so for right off the bat, you are mostly into botanicals, or at least very heavy into the mushroom world. Right.
Correct. No, in botanicals, 2,000 different botanicals and fungi. So we don't test minerals, proteins. We don't do, unfortunately, much in the sports industry that doesn't have a botanical. But obviously, a lot of the sports supplement industry is now bringing in adaptogens and other things. And the shroom boom is pretty big and coming to your space pretty quick as well. So
we had a huge growth of nootropic botanicals over the last few years, like Alpinia galanga and a lot of that kind of stuff. So it's funny because on our intro call, you kind of downplayed how much you do with sports nutrition, but I imagine it's grown over the last few years.
Yeah, I guess in my head I think protein and amino acids and those types of the powders in large aggressively named containers that we don't really touch much of those. But a lot of those, like you mentioned, a lot of those companies are putting the botanical ingredients in there. So if there's an extract of Alpinia galangal, almost guaranteed it came through my lab from some either grower or ingredient supplier or contract manufacturer. We made sure it was, in fact, the correct genus, species, plant part, and even quality or contamination levels. And then it went to that finished product that I don't test.
One of the things that I really am interested in that you're kind of talking about, and we can go any direction with this, Mike, if you have a direction you want to take this, but one of the pressing things that we brought up in our intro call was the idea of these botanicals, standardized for a certain thing, but it not actually even being from that source, just a synthesized ingredient. And, we brought up DNA testing, and you kind of, I am not an expert at this at all. It's just my understanding. And you had brought up, well, maybe DNA testing isn't really feasible for these types of things because some of them don't even have DNA left over in them at that point.
Correct. Now, I am not an expert in DNA analysis, but we actually did spend about $1 million trying to be experts in it. Quick, long story short, there was a former and disgraced Attorney General Schneiderman who woke up, attacked online gambling, student loan debt, that's pretty cool, and then also dietary supplements. And he hired a herpetologist DNA expert, so a guy that studies lizards and genetics of lizards, to analyze a bunch of supplements on major store shelves. We're talking big brands. And as we see it, about 75, maybe even 80% of the materials we test are extracts. So extracts, like Lipton iced tea as an example, is an extract of tea. It's basically chemicals from tea dried into some substrate, and then you dissolve it in water. And so there's very little DNA left in that. Now, as I understand, I think the DNA technology has come far since that attack. And now there's better access to doing DNA even on extracts. It's still is probably in its infancy stage. Long story short, there was a lab that was doing this testing for the industry. Actually, I should back up. The testing that they deployed was flawed. They made a big stink about it. New York Times ran the article, of course, never retracted it successfully, and basically said that this stuff is all failing. And big brands were hurt. I mean, big brands were severely hurt by this flawed testing. We quickly went out to grab those same bottles and brands, and were able to get a few of them. And we were able to see some of the stuff that they said there was not in there because we tested it the right way. So right method, right results. DNA has a huge future, I think, in testing botanicals. We actually hoped to bring it in at some point in time, and we were forced because there was a lab that was doing it, and people wanted us to do it instead of them. And so we brought in about $500,000 of equipment and spent another $500,000 trying to get the technology launched and ready. About a few months after we decided to get rid of the equipment and cancel the third team, the original basically author of a study that pioneered this technology was involved in a scandal about his data was actually not correct, and it was flawed, and it was fraudulent. And so it makes a lot of sense as to why we can never get it to work. Fast forward, there's still a few industries or companies in this industry that do it right, but they combine it with the testing that we do as well. So you can look at the DNA plus the phytochemical profile or fungal chemical profile to identify a plant. But there's very little DNA in extracts, and so it's really hard to deploy this, shiny object of lab testing to much of the industry. Also, it doesn't tell plant part, so if you were buying ashwagandha roots and there's leaf in it, you'll never know. And then I can sell you rotten tomato, ripe tomato, green tomato. DNA is the same all the way through, so it doesn't assess quality. It's just, is it or is it not, period, the end. So it leaves the buyer kind of hanging if you're only using that one technology.
Yeah, and there's a lot.
Yes. I was just going to say, so yeah, we wrote about Schneiderman. This was in March of 2015.
Yeah.
And I updated the post in May 8th of 2018 when he had to resign after 4 accusations of extremely racist sexual abuse. So, there was that funny update. But so overall, though, let's pull it back a little bit. Like, let's get a little education. In sports nutrition, of course, Cordyceps is obviously a popular mushroom species.
Yep.
So let's say that I'm looking at a Cordyceps. I have some Cordyceps here. Like, what are my careabouts, and how do you approach testing them and like qualifying a Cordyceps that I'm holding in my hand here?
Yeah. So, I mean, identity is really critical. Obviously, if you from a lab's perspective, you want to make sure you have the right stuff before you go testing all the other stuff. So I can look for metals, pesticides, microbiological contaminants, and residual solvents in the stuff called Cordyceps. But if it's not Cordyceps, it doesn't really matter. You're not selling Cordyceps. So the first step in GMP, good manufacturing testing, is identity testing. And we do that with HPTLC, which is high performance thin layer chromatography, basically similar to DNA analysis that you'd see in like a crime, the CSI document where you see like the bands and you can see murderer or father or whatever you're looking at. It's phytochemicals or fungal chemicals. The bands are basically come up and they match each other, and you have a match of a genus species or just a genus in some case. So we deploy HPTLC to identify Cordyceps from other species of mushrooms, or even poor quality Cordyceps cut with substrates or even mostly mycelial mass in some cases. Now, I should say that there's two camps in the fungal world. There's the above ground part, which is the mushroom, and then there's the below ground part, which is the mycelial mass. And there's the two camps both believe each other is wrong or some version of that. And then there's also some other brands that are basically mixing everything in there. One can test things in other things. So cordyceptic acid, I believe, is the primary, what we're looking for in Cordyceps. It may not be up to date on what now is the celebrated, the magic chemical that, of Cordyceps, but really identity is first. Potency is really critical because you can have the right stuff, but if it's basically, a peach that tastes like nothing, no one's going to buy your peaches again. And so that flavor profile is a chemical profile. And as you know, you can buy a peach out of season at big box retailers, and they'll be like this big, and there'll be another peach inside, and it'll never rot on your countertop. Or you can buy a peach in season, and by the time you get home, it's ready for pie, and it tastes like a dream. Both are peaches by genetics, and by HPTLC, you can see that fraction versus something that's missing just 2 bands, 1 band. And then obviously contamination. A lot of the plants on Earth are bioremediators. So basically they pull up things from the ground, they pull things from the air, and they give to you later. And so there are rules around pesticide contamination, residual solvents for extracts, how much is left over from the original solvents. In the solvent world, I mean, they use ethanol and methanol and basically, alcohol that you could drink, all the way up to very, very toxic chemicals that are necessary to pull out compounds, and they're supposed to gas off, like go away, but there's residuals. And so we test for residual solvents to make sure that's all gone. And then obviously microbiological contamination is pretty important. You can get massive health crisis from those alone. And so metals, pesticides, microbial, and residual are the other contaminants. So it's really identity, potency, and contamination are the things that we test now.
So what part of that would you consider to be the concern right now? Like how much of that is passing frequently and how much of that isn't?
So it's interesting that identity, like I said, you can have a peach and it could be a peach, but it may not be good. And, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And so quality is also in the eye of the contract manufacturer, in the sense that they can buy stuff, pass it with a very simple ID test, but never assess the quality. And, best worst case scenario is you won't get return sales. It won't work. Worst case scenario is people die. Now that hasn't happened in our industry in all of my time. When we actually started the lab, we started the lab after the FDA reacted to adulteration. Actually, it was contamination, where people took Plantiolata. It was basically a product that worked on the gut, and instead of gut, it was a product that worked on the heart. And so people actually had heart issues and ended up in the hospital. That hasn't happened again. Last year, there was a congressman's wife, I don't know if you recall this, who died, and the coroner blamed white mulberry leaf on the death. And they said that they found a piece about this big of white mulberry leaf in her stomach, and basically the cause of death was poisoning by white mulberry leaf. The industry saw that and responded very quickly, like, pick a better herb to kill someone with, because that one has been used for thousands of years. In fact, a friend of mine who pioneered some of the rebuttal of that made it a point to eat it every single day while he was working on his rebuttal. Like, he cook it with eggs in the morning, and it's just like spinach, essentially. He's like, I'm still here. That's BS. I actually wrote and talked to the journalist at Kaiser Health News, and said, look, if you had given me that leaf, would I be? And I'm a world-renowned microscopist. I mean, that's what I cut my teeth on in this lab. I spent the first 15 or so years sit at a microscope looking at identifying plants. I've taught courses all over the country. I have people now that do it for me, but published a bunch of places. So if you gave me that leaf, I wouldn't have been able to identify it as white mulberry leaf. I guarantee it. And so the fact that they picked that out and blamed that herb was BS. So my point was, no one has died from herbs or herbal supplements. And, I've been cut from podcasts for saying this, but people die in the moment that I'm saying these words from pharmaceuticals by the hundreds or maybe thousands a day. It's a different scale, of course, but these are all FDA approved safe drugs, right? And people are dying every day from them. And yet we've got herbs and we're picking on herbs. I mean, it's silly. I mean, even cannabis, which part of it is now banned by the DEA or the FDA. Teenagers have been using this for thousands of years. We're fine. We've survived, and yet they're still making a big fuss about it. Yet there's other things that are mandated that are telling people. So I don't know. I think there's quite some backwardness in this world today, and herbal medicine has been under attack since allopathic medicine woke up. It's been the alternative medicine to other things, and again has a wonderful success rate of not killing people.
I don't think you'll find any people disagreeing with you on this podcast or in our viewership here.
Yes.
And I especially, when you look at Deshay on how it actually defines a dietary supplement, when you talk about botanicals, right. There was a really great point last week at the SANS Summit for Sports and Active Nutrition about the fact that they're speaking about cannabis on the CBD panel, but it applies to a lot of botanicals. They've been around longer than we have.
Yes.
And they'll probably be here past us as well.
Yes. Exactly.
So totally agree with you on there.
Yeah.
I have one quick housekeeping question is, do you have access to some of those articles or the things that were published or the videos of that guy? Because I'd love to put them in the show notes.
Of the
research. Yeah.
I don't have videos of my friend eating the mulberry leaf, but I can definitely get you some stuff on that for sure.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And it was funny, as the rebuttal was written and I was cited on it, and so was that guy. Like, look, and I said, like, the coroner did a bad job, and they sent it to a researcher at UC Davis. I mean, it's not a new university. They have good people, and I'm not here to disparage that person, but they got it wrong. And even if they did find that much mulberry leaf is not toxic. So my suspicion is the unfortunate, I think her name was Carrie. I think she was probably taking some sort of diet pills, and diet pills that are bought from the internet could have other chemicals in it. A lot of times people throw in pharmaceutical active APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. So sibutramine, as an example, is a weight loss pharmaceutical. I believe that was once FDA approved and safe, and now it's banned. And people have been known to put it in diet pills. And let's say she took that and had something else going on, that would be a reasonable cause for death. But that was all swept under the rug, and we don't talk about it. And that article was published, and that was that. But I'll send something to you.
Testing it as a fool. Sorry, Mike, but it seems like over the time that I've been in the industry, there's been a few different times where testing has been used for a massive point, and the people running the testing simply did not understand how to properly run the testing. It's interesting to me. Like, I remember, if you guys remember Labdoor of 5 years ago, like they were running these huge posts on rating brands, and it turned out they didn't even know how to test like very simple things. Like, I know you don't test amino acids, but my understanding is we understand them quite well. It shouldn't be a problem to be able to test for them. Is there a reason why there's so much discrepancy in the testing industry?
Plants are challenging. Chemists are born to test chemicals, and chemicals generally isolated or by themselves. Plants have thousands of them, and they're trapped in cells with sugar and tannins and all sorts of other stuff. So, we've been doing plant analysis, mushroom analysis since, almost 30 years now. There are the labs that realize that there's game here, and they've either tried to crush us or acquire us. And, I use this, this is my banner all the time. This is my life, big lab versus me all the time. I don't know if you guys can see that in the video. It's David and Goliath. Sorry, I'm not sure if you can see that. But so anyways, the challenge is that there are labs that do everything. They test tilapia, they test leather dyes. Some of them test, kitchen utensils. You can't do everything perfect. Can't do everything great. Pick an area of genius and stay there is my opinion. And so we know plants. We know how they work. Back to that Schneiderman thing, the herpetologist, geneticist was probably a really great herpetologist geneticist, but animals are much more simple from the genetic world than plants. I mean, mint and lemon will figure it out someday, and they'll be like a minty lemon. This happens. I mean, pluots and all the various fruit that we have nowadays, they're promiscuous, they pollen, they do their thing. An iguana and a dog will never figure that out. Maybe in a different country with different ethics rules and weird labs. But the fact is, when you're testing iguanas, it's iguana and it's newt and it's gecko. Apple has millions of different, not millions, but thousands of different varieties. Mint and spearmint are very, very similar chemically, with exception of like one chemical, menthol. That's how you differentiate them in the lab. So it is pretty common that people think that they can quickly just jump into plant identity testing and do a good job. But the fact is, there's no true criteria for what is Echinacea angustifolia root. We say your Echinacea angustifolia root has phytochemicals from Profile X that match the phytochemical fingerprint of our reference material from Profile X. But if you don't compare the right profile, or if you don't consider the variety that nature produces, you could, wrongfully pass, wrongfully fail things. And so it is a nuanced approach. It's probably why we're still here and haven't been, crushed into obsolescence, which has been basically the threat for many, many years.
Right. I guess that to follow up, so a lot of times I've seen, at least for like the mineral testing, there's standards there. There's published ways of testing for various vitamin D and the metabolites and stuff.
Yeah.
So have you had to pioneer your own methods sometimes, or the reference materials, you have to keep that on hand, or is it?
Yeah. So we have, so caffeine is an example. It's very easy to test caffeine, pure caffeine, even just pure white powder caffeine. There's like probably 15 accepted methods to do that with an HPLC or even UV or other things. You put caffeine into different products with other ingredients, there's no method for that. Now, unfortunately, I'll say substandard companies will appeal to ignorance, be like, well, I guess there's no method for it. I guess I'll just use the paper trail and we're good to go. And that's trust, which I'm not a huge fan of trust. I'm a huge fan of verifying. With the plants, it's definitely different. We have a room in our facility, and you're both welcome anytime. We're in Orange County, love doing lab tours and lunches. The room's called an herbarium. You might see it at like Smithsonian Museum or University of California, Los Angeles. UCLA has one. World-renowned herbariums, millions of accessions, every plant on the planet, grasses, palm trees. We have one with about 20,000 specimens from 2,000 species of herbs. on site, and it's a big room. It's, a little bigger than this office space. It's kept cool, and it's basically just accessions that we've tested and passed for years and years and years. So what that gives us is the knowledge, both mentally, but also backed up on servers, of what Echinacea angustifolia root should look like for almost 30 years of the industry's Echinacea angustifolia root. So when we get a sample in and we fail it, and the customer goes back to who they bought it from, and they bought it from someone who says, well, we tested it, passed. Where's your data packet? They give us a data packet, some garbage chromatograph using the wrong standards, the wrong method. I mean, if I looked at ginkgo leaf with a root method and I wouldn't see the ginkgo leaf compounds, I would pass it, basically ignorantly to the wrong spec. And that's something we see quite often. People who don't understand chromatography are basically using the wrong methods on the wrong plants, even the wrong plant parts. And ignorance is bliss. I mean, you just pass it because it looks fuzzy here, must look fuzzy there. It's like saying all red fruit are tomatoes, but there's other red fruit. And so it's a nuanced approach, and you do have to have reference samples, which is one hard thing for labs to acquire. There are methods for Echinacea angustifolia root. There's very few of them. Not every botanical is covered. And like you said, we do have to develop methods our own, which we've been doing for many, many years. So we're actually ISO 17025 accredited for all plants and fungi by HPTLC and microscopy, because we have so many that we can't possibly be ISO accredited for each individual single one. So basically identity by HPTLC micro for all plants and fungi under the sun and under the water, which makes us quite special.
So I imagine, I think I know the answer to this question, but how often are you faced with a challenge where someone's asking you to test something and you just don't have any background on this? And
right.
I assume that like with Atkins diets and a lot of fads in this industry, everything's very cyclical. But like I mentioned Alpina Glenga before, there seems to have been a surgence of new compounds coming to the market. How often do you need to phone a friend or something?
Yeah, so we have botanists that work for us all over the planet. So if we needed a plant that comes from Ecuador, we have a botanist in South America who you have to wait till the spring in the flowering stage. They'll go to the fields and they'll find the plant, and you originally key plants based on the flower and the flower parts. So if it's out of season, you can't do it that way. But we'll have botanists all around the world to get us a reference material. So let's say you send us this plant that your buddy found in his trip to Nepal, and you want to start testing for it. And this has actually happened, a resin ball from Nepal, and it makes we're like, okay, well, and there's no reference material. How am I going to compare it? You have to compare X to X, right? So we would have to wait until we can find a reference material. In absence of that, what we can do is just say your stuff that you call X matches other things that we found in the market called X, and at least there's some consistency of that, and you can kind of perpetuate that. As far as new chemicals go, when I want to test caffeine in green tea, we buy pure caffeine from VWR or Chromanex or extra synthase or whatever it is. That has been tested and known of purity. We use that in our HPLCs as a reference standard. Now, let's say you come back to me and say, well, I've got peak X. Well, what the hell is peak X? And that's a thing we've had to measure. We started the lab right when I was like 17. So I was just getting in high school, entering college, studying chemistry, and I would bring my organic chemistry professors these reports that we were trying to figure out. He was like, this is not the naming convention of a molecule follows a process. And people were showing up to my lab, can you measure this with these strange names, isoberberine alkaloid, like isoberberine alkaloid. Those are three different things, and the molecule that they were asking us to test didn't resemble those three things. So it was bullshit. And so it is a challenge. We have to have a standard to test a thing, a number, and sometimes the standards aren't available. So there are entities that will actually go and extract them. Extra synthase, as an example, a French company we've worked with, will go and you can pay them to isolate and extract and purify a compound so that you can then verify that crazy compound that someone said they had. But that's a challenge for sure. It's not always, though. We don't get that too often. Your industry, the sports supplement industry, seems to be pretty fun, excited about new compounds and definitely challenges the labs in the field with the innovation that's goes pretty fast.
Yeah, we work with a number of different brands that are pushing it in terms of innovation. We also work with some ingredient companies over the last couple of years that have come with these new ingredients. And it's funny because you can kind of tell the quality of the contract manufacturer when they're like, hold up, I have no clue how to test that. I'm not willing to manufacture that.
Right.
there's 6 brands already with it on the market.
Yeah.
How did that get right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, everyone
It's
wants
pretty wild. Yeah. And so the FDA is, in the case of my business, my best friend, they're understaffed. There's no cops at the stop sign. People are speeding past it every day. And that's kind of the unfortunate situation that they need extra budget for extra agents on the ground to test the quality of stuff. In the meantime, all the cheaters are going to continue cheating until they get busted. And the guys behind these companies, I've met some really amazing and eccentric characters in our industry that I have helped make millions because I've been able to qualify their material successfully and help them be standalone from the others. But they're fly by nights a lot of times. And this is not the industry. This is a very small part of the industry that are these people that basically jump in, sell some crazy ingredient, jump out, never come back. They're off to doing some other entrepreneurial thing with the rest of their money. But yeah, to answer your question, labs are constantly chasing innovation. I consider myself a marketing guy with a chemistry degree. That's how I identify as a human marketing guy, or told you so as well. But so that's the new one. But marketing guy with a chemistry degree, and I will say it on stage, like the marketing teams are sometimes the biggest problem of companies because they're so far ahead of what is possible to back up, actually make correctly and stable. They have these ideas of pills within pills of pills. Well, that's a hard thing to get a pill inside a liquid pill. And there's only a few big brands that actually do it right. But these ideas are hard and sometimes they don't work out. And sometimes the pills break open in shipping and whatnot. Or sometimes we market things that there's no way to actually prove it's there. Some of these brands have, hundreds of ingredients. They're no longer in therapeutic doses. We call that fairy dusting in our industry. And there's only one reason in there is, raspberry ketones are pretty sexy. Let's put them in there, even though there's not even enough to find and measure. And the unfortunate thing is that any, trial attorney could take that product to a lab and say, do your best to find this product or find this ingredient. They fail it. And then, it's lawyer time. And basically you're just giving your money from lawyer to lawyer. And that happens pretty often that, products are challenged and they can't actually back up what's on that label because they've gone way too far with the marketing guys and had proprietary blend after proprietary blend after proprietary blend.
Have you been used as an expert witness in cases like that?
We have a couple times. We shy away from that. We early on in our lab days, we were countersued for doing that. And that was back when it was just my father and I. It was like, I think I could say now, the Trim Spa, the Hoodia days, they were unfortunately selling material that was not what it said to be. And we were an expert witness and they turned around and sued everyone. And back then it was like $15,000 to have my lawyer just talk to their lawyers a bunch of times. And that was, that almost sank our ship back in the day. This is, very early on in the lab. So we proceed with caution with those cases. Generally, those cases will go to universities. They seem to have more establishment or more legitimacy in the court for some reason. But yeah, so occasionally we'll do that, but we kind of shy away from it because it generally gets us into trouble somehow.
Gotcha. Thanks. So one thing that so you are kind of seeing products before they are products in a perfect world and everything. So one thing that we've been talking a lot about on this podcast is trends in general. Have you caught any trends over the last year or two that catch your eye at all? And it doesn't need to be sports nutrition.
Yeah, well, just with COVID, there are those of us that try to stay healthy and keep our bodies ready to do what they do, which is fight bugs. The three of us right now are fighting off disease and infection as we speak. It's when our immune systems get tired that they let the bugs in and they win. So with COVID, we saw a lot of folks really leaning into the immune system herbs and immune system vitamins. We couldn't say back then that vitamin D was going to help you, but we all knew it. And now this reports are coming out a little bit late, right? It's too bad we all sheltered inside and didn't take our vitamin D because I believe very strongly that had the public known about that, there would have been millions of people who didn't die of whatever they died from. But yeah, the elderberry push was pretty huge. And of course, when that happened, we were testing a lot of elderberry, failing a lot of elderberry because of supply chain demand issues. There was no elderberry because of shipping challenges. Folks had to go find new elderberry, and as a result, the elderberry adulteration went through the roof. It was definitely the most popular herb we were testing at that time. At some point in time, one of our customers saw reports online that were ours, but they weren't, and so people were basically taking our reports and adulterating our reports changing lot numbers, changing results, changing dates, and customer sends it to us, we can see very clearly that it was not accurate. And we're actually working with a blockchain company right now to try to sort that out and make sure that doesn't happen again. But we paid our lawyers money to send a cease and desist letter to 3 different addresses in China. There's no recourse, of course, to that. And then a mere 2 weeks later, we got hacked and ransomware, and we were shut down for 2 weeks. And the FDA was here, the FBI was here, Homeland Security was here. Because of the 2 things that kind of happened around the same time, it was a little peculiar, right? It was almost like a retaliatory attack. There's no evidence to confirm that. And I actually got to hand a computer to an FBI agent in a parking lot, which was kind of like on my bucket list. And this all happened like right in the middle of early COVID, where everyone was really, really afraid, and it was just a mess. So, that was a strange time. So, the trends of the immune system have not stopped. We usually have weight loss season and cold and flu season. It's been cold and flu season for about 3 years. And we're still seeing constant testing of those herbs. And now the mushrooms have sort of been rebranded. They've been here for millions of years and thousands of years in trade. Suddenly the shroom boom is excited everyone to take their mushrooms again. And so that's fantastic. I truly believe in them. I've been taking them forever. But that's another issue. The mushroom craze, where folks are against supply chain demand and adulteration and fortification, all pushing the immune aspect of basically making sure you're healthy enough so you don't really have to rely on the government prescribed regimens.
So I wouldn't be Ben if I didn't bring this up. You talked about psilocybin at the beginning of this podcast, and we're rounding out the second half, so it's about time for me.
I was waiting.
I wait for the second half. Yeah, I wait for the second half of the podcast before I start. Yes. How much more have you been dealing with that? I'm fascinated by the subject. I'm fascinated by the possible decriminalization,
everything,
and recreation. I'm not admitting to anything on this podcast, but I'd love to hear all.
I will. It's a subject near dear to my heart. It's I was raised Orthodox Jewish, never bought a second of it. Always enjoyed the stories and the morals, but I've always been into nature and took psychedelics very early. I have 2 little kids now, and the thought of them taking what I took at the age I took it makes me want to throw up my trash can. But it worked out okay for me. We have this rare DEA registration. DEA Schedule 1, 2, 3, and 4. So basically, we have the federally legal right to test any plant, any substance. We have a cabinet in a room in the lab where we keep very tiny little micro ampules. You wouldn't really get anything from them. They're in alcohol and whatever. The challenge to that is we can only work with folks who have the equivalent receiving end of that. So like, let's say you find some psilocybin mushrooms, you want me to test them, I can't work for you because federally you have no right to have that stuff. Unfortunately, the same applies to cannabis. Recreational cannabis is federally illegal. So I've watched that cannabis bus drive by every day. We touch hemp. Actually today we got a bag this big, you can't see, humongous bag of hemp from local authorities. Basically, we do overflow testing on hemp farms. They want to make sure the hemp guys are hemp guys and not recreational guys. So the only customers I have right now in the hemp area is the feds, which is just amazing and funny. We do some work. We have done some work with psilocybin, oddly for a company in Canada, and there's a bunch of projects in the works to help make sure people have the correct, starting material, correct strength and ingredients. Same thing with we did some ayahuasca work, which is cool. The grandfather of psychedelics. I think what Joe Rogan said, it was like times 1,000 plus aliens or something, or so yeah, it's, it's this is actually a piece of Banisteriopsis cacti. It's a piece of the vine that is one of the 2 ingredients of ayahuasca, another substance near and dear to my heart. And so yeah, I'm just honored to be a small part in the quality testing of that. Unfortunately, the biggest part of that industry is not federally legal, and so there's a whole bunch of them that are basically doing. Now, it's possible to have a lab of your own and do the right quality work. The legit labs are generally better because they don't have to hide and be scared and buy the correct reference standards from the correct company, not have to isolate, make it themselves. I'm not saying it's impossible to do it without being federally legal, but it's generally better. But unfortunately, I can't service them because they don't qualify under the rules that we have to play. But what's interesting about that industry, and unlike the cannabis industry, that the pharmaceutical industry really didn't touch cannabis. I mean, I understand Pfizer just had a big placement in some sort of cannabis company, which is pretty interesting. Meanwhile, CBD is being sort of regulated out of our industry. So it's going away here and coming in over there, which is no surprise to us in this call. But pharma is very interested in psychedelics. because there's a lot of promise of interesting, benefits. There's a study a while back about psilocybin and alcoholism, and it had remarkable results. Unlike any pharmaceutical drug that is on the market today, deemed safe and effective. I mean, the numbers of actual success rates were 10 times that in the psychedelic or in the psilocybin study for alcoholism. So like smoking cessation, addiction issues. Ayahuasca is called, 10,000 hours of therapy in 1 hour for a reason. You take it once, you don't want to take it again for a long time. It's not something that you're going to go back and take every day before work or every night when you get home. There's nothing addictive about it. Even mushrooms, I mean, lab animals won't come back. They'll go back for sugar. They go back for cocaine, for alcohol, for caffeine. But when they take a strong psychedelic, they're like, we're good. Thank you. Pass.
Yeah. Something I find really interesting is I live in Princeton, New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, and over the border of Philly, there's a lot of psychedelic therapy offerings.
Yeah.
But they are almost exclusively ketamine trials.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I don't know. To me, I'm very passionate about the natural quality of mushrooms. Like, I don't need to tell you any of this, but so much of humans' evolution is tied very closely to psychedelic mushrooms.
Yep.
And to me, it seems like humans and fungus are intertwined in the way that we help each other, right?
Yeah.
I don't understand for the life of me why ketamine is getting so popular as a horse tranquilizer. Like, it just seems counter to everything.
I have never taken it myself. I know people who have and have benefited from it. I know people who are running ketamine clinics. I know several individuals from our industry who have moved over there and moved to that category of the industry. I have a suspicion that it's easier because it's a pure pharmaceutical chemical, right? And it's easier to test. It's pure pharmaceutical chemical. Caffeine is like the easiest thing in the whole world to test. Vitamin C, no question about it. Mushrooms, how do you know if that's the right thing? How do you in the dosage of mushrooms is varied based upon a lot of variables. Like I said, peaches out of season are still peaches, right? And so mushrooms may have this dose. And so when you get into like the world of medical treatment, you want consistent dosage. And so I think that's my suspicion is why ketamine has been so popular, because it's available, it's synthesized, it's easy to identify. There's probably labs in Canada that are saying yes to it, making sure it's legit all day long. Whereas mushrooms, ayahuasca, there's these other sort of nuances to the natural end of it. And it's hard for any researcher to publish a paper with results where the DMT harmony level will vary depending on the brew, which is dependent upon the location of where these materials grew, how they grew, when they were picked, how they were dried, how long they were stewed together. All of these things are challenges, and I think my fear is that Big Pharma is going to try to make pharmawaska in a sense. They're going to try to pull out those two chemicals. I don't know if you've ever tried one of these fortified joints with THC, crack, whatever crap is on these things. It's not the same. Smoking a THC heavy joint is not the same as smoking a bowl of flower. It's a completely different experience. In fact, one that I have tried once, twice and said, no thanks, I'm not going back to this shatter and the waxes and all these crazy things. And so I don't believe that you can actually get the same effect from pharmawaska as you could from actually drinking the thick, nasty molasses brew and having the actual experience that it perhaps was intended. Same for mushrooms. It's not just psilocybin or psilocin. There's other compounds in there that play together in the synergistic effect. That, the cannabis industry coined the entourage effect. Well, prior to that, it was the synergistic effect of all the botanicals. It's not echinacea, it's all the echinacea compounds, in there. Not cordyceptic acid, it's cordyceps as a whole. Which, when you extract a plant, you take out a bunch of stuff. So it's not just one single chemical. So the other thing with pharmaceuticals is they like their subscription models. They don't want you to take one thing and be done. And psychedelics are not a subscription model. I mean, you can microdose on a regular basis, but no one's going to make much money from that. Mushrooms grow in shit for free all over the world, even in the cold places, the warm places. So it's not. I don't know if they're going to ever push the raw material. Which my concern is they'll find synthetic or create synthetic versions of these so they can control. Yeah. And then of course, the path is to make the natural part illegal so they can sell their legal versions of it, which we'll see what happens. But I mean, I'm amazed at how many small pharma companies are actively interested in, prominently branding and marketing these therapies with illegal ingredients somehow through the professional channel of, psychotherapy and DEA regulations, and they're doing it, and it's becoming more prevalent, which is, I think, fascinating. I mean, the world needs it. I would say that for sure, more now than ever before.
I had some suspicions that just because of culturally wise, mushrooms and ayahuasca had movements, and ketamine wasn't as much of, an anti-subculture or whatever. Like it wasn't involved with Woodstock or whatever. It was a little bit easier to take that a medicinal route and feel very clinical. Whereas, mushrooms were basically the equivalent of like reefer madness because they open up your mind a little bit.
Hippie products, versus, a fine, like you said, fine pharmaceutical. I always heard about ketamine in, like in clubs. It was like a club drug, and I've never been one for anonymous powdered drugs. I've never trusted those. Obviously, my whole life is about not trusting these things and then verifying it for my colleagues and friends. So, that doesn't appeal to me now or the future. But the natural products for sure. There's so much power in these plants, even unknown at this point. And there's some really great pioneers in the industry that are doing great work to help popularize them.
I'll let Mike go after this. The one comment I have is that kind of like what you're talking about, like, not being maybe a club scene or anything, but I also just think the idea of doing something dissociative in a like lab, as someone with like major white coat syndrome, like that makes me think of like horrible trips. Like the idea of being in a white room with the person I don't know taking something dissociative is crazy to me.
Yeah. I've sort of oddly tried to volunteer for a few of those. Never been a good candidate because I think probably because my experience in the not white rooms. But my first mushroom experience was in at 10,000 feet in the high Sierras near a brook, by a pile with moss and wildflowers, and that's where it should happen, in my opinion. With family, in fact, and at a very early age, actually, and that's when the magic happens. It's in these therapies in the white room, like you said. I think some of the original research was like end of life stage cancer patients. I think people helping people, and we have a friend of the family that does that exactly work as a therapist or a psychiatrist that does that work. He does amazing work. I'm not going to mention names, but if you look into that, he's prominent in the mushroom industry.
I can imagine.
He's doing this work, like I said, in these sort of like controlled settings. But these are people who are already living in beds in hospitals that are basically, they have a couple days left. They want to make peace with the whole process, and they have a remarkable experience. And then, they shed fear and they shed ego. I took ayahuasca last year in March, and I've changed from the standpoint of like, I've just surrender to things that scare me and surrender to, not that I focus on my own death, but basically when I had my experience, I feel like I had died. And so I have experience now being dead or dying, and I fear it less. And for me, it taught me just basically just realize you can't control everything and you need to let go. So that kind of work in those scenarios where you're basically in life patients, I can see that happening. But for like depression or addiction stuff, I don't know how that would, like you said, I don't know if that would be a cool scene or not for me at least.
Yeah, I feel what you feel about needing to be. I mean, if you're using something natural that comes from the earth, I would prefer to be using it in earth, in an earth, right? In a way like that. It just feels like it would be much more of a connection. Being the fifth on any of that sort of thing. But if I were involved, that would be how I'd feel about it. Mike, you looked like you had something you had to say before. I apologize.
Yeah, so you have a fentanyl crisis going on. You've mentioned that you don't want to like be taking random stuff in a club or whatever, but there's very clearly a risk and a problem out there. From your perspective, like, let's say, what would you tell my cousin who's 18 years old, entering college and everything? Like, how would you even go about the drugs? Like, would you just tell them to stay the F away from them, or like?
Just the other day they busted, like, I think it was 250 pounds of fentanyl in Orange County, which is, I live in Orange County. This stuff could have passed by my home, or if I was in the business of buying drugs from people I didn't know, they were in the powdered form, or had teenage kids or college kids. It's scary. That's enough to kill like millions of people, and that stuff's really, really strong. And it was here. It made it through the border. And it was just a random traffic stop. It wasn't like that's the car, let's get it. It was like they probably didn't signal, and then the cop figured out something was off, and they figured out, and to your friends and relatives, I say keep it natural. I mean, I have still not taken ecstasy, and originally when it was available when I was in high school, it was more like on principle. Like that shit was $25 a pill, And I knew for a fact it didn't cost them $25 a pill. And it was the economic robbery that I was like, I'm going to contribute to this fraud. And it could have been an amazing experience. I have friends that have had really great times. And even today, currently I know people who take it, from a medicinal standpoint, as therapy and whatnot. And it's pretty powerful stuff. But I've just always been, I don't know about afraid, just more cautious about the chemical drugs. Because you can't, you look at pot, you can look at the flower, you can see it's pot. You look at mushrooms, you can look at mushrooms and see it's mushrooms. Some sort of at least visual organoleptic identification possible. White powder, you really need chemical tests. And I don't know if they're still around, but there was a company called Dance Safe. They used to populate the raves. And I think it was a nonprofit. I have no idea how they didn't get busted all the time. Maybe they did, but they would, them. They would be around in a what they were called raves back then, but EDM concerts now, I guess. They rebranded, everything's rebranded. And they would offer a service where you basically scratch your ecstasy and make sure that you have pure ecstasy, and then be like, have a great time. And it was a free service, I believe. I don't know if they're still around, but I mean, hats off to them for being pioneers in quality in a, scary industry.
They actually make a lot of social media content now. I don't know how they don't get busted. It seems like, where there's smoke, there's fire. It would be easy to bust them, but they make a lot of really helpful content. I think it's Dance Safe. It's some sort of version of that.
Yeah.
And they sell reagent tests.
Little kits, right?
Yes, which is not, HPLC.
Better than nothing.
Well, I mean, if you test for commonly found, like, additives, right? If you could test for fentanyl, you would know, like, hey, if it glows purple or whatever, you don't touch this.
Right.
It's funny. They get a lot of comments from probably people like us who would caution, like, hey, that doesn't mean it's necessarily safe
or a good idea.
Yeah. But it definitely is some sort of risk mitigation, right?
Yeah.
Like you're at least testing for things that they're often found. But there's a lot of, and I don't need to tell you this, of course, but like there's a lot of things that are easily faking the stuff for that.
Yeah.
Research chemicals that could, severely put you into a bad mental state, if not keep you there for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. And I went
on their website. It looks like they have a new and improved fentanyl test strip. So you might know that you don't have that. It doesn't necessarily mean you're getting what you think you're getting, but at least it's not fentanyl.
I mean, the cops could do it by your car, right? So I mean, there's obviously these reagent kits, like you mentioned, Dance Safe was in a sense aiding and abetting illegal activities, but clearly they never got enough trouble to shut down. I imagine they got some flack and they got lawsuits and whatnot. But I think they did an amazing thing back in the day, and I'm just happy that they're still around offering this service, because fentanyl wasn't around when we were kids, and that was, maybe it was, but it wasn't a traded street drug, and that stuff is very scary, to the point where like any white powder drug or anything synthetic is off my, not just because of that, but also because of that, off my radar forever.
I find that really interesting and compelling, and when you blow that up to the scale of what the dietary supplement industry is, and you realize how many manufacturers are just importing, oil drums of white powder. And, I've seen contract manufacturers test stuff and it be very much a different thing entirely than what they're looking for. I mean, like talking like estrogen birth control instead of leucine, it's pretty scary to think about the fact that people are manufacturing tons of powder that they don't even know what it is.
Yeah. Well, China will sell you what you want. If you want the best quality stuff, China will provide it to you, and it'll be the best quality stuff you can imagine. If you also want to pay $2 a pound, you're going to get $2 a pound stuff. And so, unfortunately, the FDA, they made GMPs, good manufacturing practices, in 2007. They republished version, and they said basically use scientifically valid methods, not scientifically validated, scientifically valid methods. So, there's those two words mean something, but what it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean the right technique. It basically means throw some science at it, and maybe we'll see you in court. And so there are techniques in this industry like FTNIR and FDIR that basically a probe shines the light out of powder, bounces back an amplitude of something, creates a fingerprint. You compare that fingerprint to something else that is already in a digital library of that machine, and you're good to go. When we started the lab, and like I mentioned, I was in college in chemistry, and I was sharing that technique with my professors. I'm like, well, that's made for fine chemicals. That technology shines light at fine chemicals, looks at bond angles and, other compounds, bounces back and says, this is, estrogen birth control as an example, or leucine. That when you do that for botanicals or complicated powders of mixtures, it gets more complicated. Now we rely on algorithms, which I'm not a huge fan of them these days. You know, they are, you know, said to be neutral, but they're not. You know, this chat GPT thing is insane. And people are using it to get data. They're rewriting definitions and history, and, you know, where's my Encyclopedia Britannica? I mean, that's where the knowledge was static, right? So the point I'm making is that there are all sorts of techniques that a contract manufacturer can use to identify and satisfy the GMPs, and they're not always the right way. And the FDA is just simply not staffed enough to go in and get all those guys. So, man, can you imagine if the bodybuilder's taking leucine, but it ends up being estrogen birth control? I mean, it's completely different effects.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a wild thought process. I mean, and it really, would you like dumb it down and really think about it? Like, there are people that are just getting giant tubs of white powder from China and saying that probably is an amino acid, and just throwing it in and selling it to millions of people.
Well, it reminds me of the vaping industry. I mean, our old lab, we had some guys that basically, when I would leave the lab, they would come to work, and they were, I think they were tattoo artists. And so they would leave the tattoo shop, then come to work at night. And when they opened up their big bay door, there was basically these 50-gallon drums and some chemical from China versus some chemical from China, and like a vape cartridge machine. And these guys were just basically randomly buying stuff off the internet and putting them into cartridges and selling them. And then kids would basically take that and freebase it. That's what it is, by the way, to go from that liquid into the gas form is freebasing, which has a really bad connotation for other things.
Yeah.
They're basically freebasing this unknown mixture of chemicals right into your lungs in about 2 seconds, heartbeat, brain. And it's in your brain. I mean, it's affecting your neurons that fast. I mean, tobacco, you know, cannabis, you take a hit, you feel it instantly, pretty much, right? A vape pen, same thing, but at least the cannabis, you can see it. These vape juice cartridges, there's a whole other topic. We could do a podcast on that. I mean, I hear some people are not smoking cigarettes because they're vaping these things instead, and perhaps it's better because there's less particulate matter in the vape cartridge versus the tobacco smoke, but you don't know what you're getting. And it's not regulated very well, if at all. I mean, remember that vitamin E acetate scare with kids getting popcorn lung from their cannabis vape? I mean, that was completely unknown why or when that was happening until they figured it out. And that was all over the place. And, you know, young children ruining their lungs forever with that stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, smoking is a whole nother topic that we could spend another hour on. But I definitely, it's funny because vape cartridges, both in nicotine and cannabis, are so widely used now. And it's seen as so innocuous, and I'm not convinced. You know, I don't necessarily think it's bad, but I don't know if it's any better.
No, I would say it's worse, just because the unknown capacity. And hear this out. When the laws changed, when cannabis was legalized, it was to combust the flower in a pipe. You basically use fire, you burn flower, you inhale the smoke. That was that. And then it went edible based on oils from the flower. And that was like the next version, which was never made legal. That was never the intended use. And then it turned into fine extracts and or synthetic versions, freebased in battery cartridge pens from China. We have strayed so far from the original intention. My example is, if I wanted to make a chamomile product, a flower that's been drank by people for thousands of years, you know, before bed. But if I want to take, chamomile noids, some chemical I just made up, right, and isolate them and put them in a glycerin cartridge and inhale it, I'd be in jail and my money would be gone, because you can't huff natural products. There's no inhalation products allowed in our industry. That is not a delivery mechanism given to us. That's strictly for pharmaceuticals. But, you know, tobacco and cannabis, you have to have a blast. Go for it. Right? It's like, these are crazy divergent rules that are applied whichever way they want to go. I'm amazed that it's gotten as far as it has. But when it comes all back down is the quality of these ingredients. They should be checked, and the labs should be like your biggest asset. We are gatekeepers to quality, and we should be as transparent as we could possibly be. We should share all the data. There's no reason not to. And trust, you know, it's not a 4-letter word. It's cousin. It's a 5-letter word. It's really, you know, transparency is a vehicle for which trust is communicated. And my friend Scott Steinfeld said those words. Transparency is a vehicle for which trust is communicated. And that's the only value proposition we have left, is to really be transparent about the quality of these products. Whether it's a vape cartridge with something in it, at least show the lab results. At least do that. Or it's chamomile, or if it's a psilocybin product, or St. John's wort. There's absolutely no reason to hide that data, to you know, give comfort and confidence that you have what's actually, you know, in the bottles, actually what's on the labels in the bottle. Well, it's pretty simple, you know.
Well, I see you on a bunch more podcasts with us. I think there's a lot to be discussed. I thank you so much for the hour.
Yeah.
It's been really, really good, but it almost left me with more questions than I do have answers. So we'll have to continue this again.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. A lot of fun. Thank you.
Mike,
Yeah, thank you.
Mike, did you have a question or something?
I do. I mean, do you have a hard stop in 4 minutes?
I do have a hard stop in 4 minutes, but that's just an invitation to do this more again.
Excellent. Can I ask one last question?
Yeah.
So if I made you emperor for a day, you mentioned a lot of things. Like, what would you change? Like the GMPs or anything? Like you mentioned, you want things that are scientifically validated, not just scientifically valid. Is there like one law you could?
I would have the FDA dictate exactly what methods to use for exactly what tests. They said identity testing, blast, good to go. It should be specific methods that are fit for purpose. Light boxes with your phone that identify plants in powder form. I mean, I can't understand how that's legally used. We should be looking at chemical fingerprints against verified reference materials. So yeah, emperor for a day, I would change the rules and make the FDA be very specific about how to test things. And then, I'll go over to the other industry in pharmaceuticals and we'd have a blast if I was the emperor for the day. That'd be but I would be quickly murdered, as we can imagine. So
Cool.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Elan.
Yeah, guys, my pleasure. A lot of fun.
Thank you. We'll talk.